The coronavirus pandemic has upended the lives of millions of women across the country, especially when it comes to jobs and the economy. 275,000 women left the workforce this past January compared to 71,000 men, according to the U.S. Labor Department. A CBS News article takes a closer look at exactly why the pandemic is taking such a toll on women's lives, especially women of color. So CBS News MoneyWatch reporter Aimee Picchi wrote that article, and she's with us now from Burlington, Vermont, to talk more about this. Thank you so much for joining us, Aimee. You know, right before the pandemic hit, there was sort of this big celebration because the workforce was now just a little over 50% female, and that was considered a major accomplishment. This pandemic has just sort of slaughtered that number. And many people have described the economic fallout as, you know, essentially a recession, a woman-only recession. Not only women, but women have been disproportionately impacted by it. In your article, you talk to all sorts of different women, including, you know, one with a master's degree who said her master's degree really didn't count for much. Her husband doesn't have that same level of education, but he was able to secure a job. Can we talk about just why women have been hit so hard compared to men this past year?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me on. It's really interesting because some people have been calling this a she session. And some of the experts I spoke to said, you know, this is not a great term because this is an issue that impacts the whole economy. It impacts men and women. It's not really just only limited to women. It impacts our whole economy. And without women going back into the workforce, as they were before the pandemic, our economy won't be able to recover to the same size that it was before the pandemic. So, you know, a couple of things are happening here. One is that women are more likely to work in jobs that were hit harder by the pandemic early on. These are service jobs. These are jobs that are done in person, you know, in restaurants, hotels, cleaning services. And those were really hurt because, you know, as we all know, suddenly and then the other side of it is that women, you know, as always, tend to take on more caregiving roles and more work at home. And with children suddenly in remote school, they were unable to manage both. Some felt they were unable to manage both work and managing their children at home, and that they felt like they had to take on more of that work. You know, the woman I spoke to who has a master's degree, that's actually what happened to her, is that her daughter was in remote school and needed a lot of help. The daughter's 10, and her husband found work as a pilot and was able to get employment that way. And they needed the money. Their freelance work had dried up. And so she had to take on that role, basically doing everything at home because her husband's suddenly away much of the time. But this has happened. It happened actually with a few other women I spoke to as well, that, you know, their husbands' jobs were demanding and they had to take on more work at home with their children. So, you know, another thing we're seeing is that women with children are really impacted by this in terms of stress, you know, higher workloads, anxiety. Another woman I spoke to said that she runs her own business, but she's doing work from 7 at night till midnight because it's the only time she has to do the work to get it done.
Yeah. Yeah, I spoke to a friend of mine. She has 2 children, and she said, you know, I get up early in the morning. I can watch you on TV because I have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to make sure that I get all my work done so I can then help my kids with homeschooling. And so part of this conversation, too, is not just about women losing their jobs, but also women downsizing their positions so they could handle this additional responsibility. The other thing that your article focuses on is the impact that this has had on women of color in particular. I want to play a little bit of what Vice President Kamala Harris had to say about that during a recent speech.
Black women workers are being forced out of the workforce in record numbers. And so many Black small businesses are being forced to close their doors. In so many ways, this pandemic has been an accelerator. And for those for whom things were bad before, they're even worse now. For the fissures and the failures, the defects, the flaws in our system during the course of this pandemic have been blown up for all to see.
Okay, so, what the vice president says there is, what we've seen over and over again in other areas. Why have women of color been particularly impacted?
Yeah, I mean, she's exactly right that the pandemic has really exposed a lot of the systemic issues that our economy always had, but that, suddenly we can see this and the impact that it's having on women and especially women of color. So again, it's, women of color are more likely to work in low-wage jobs, often service jobs, so they're harder hit because of this. And those jobs also have fewer benefits. They're low paid, and they don't have support like childcare or paid leave, paid sick leave. So they're just being hit at a higher rate. It is a real crisis. The one thing that the upside possibly is that because we're seeing these cracks in our system, that there could be a movement towards actually addressing these problems and these issues. For instance, in some of the relief bills, there was actually paid leave, paid sick leave, paid family leave. And so some experts are hopeful that after the pandemic is over, it will broaden support for things like paid parental leave. The U.S. is I think the only industrialized country that doesn't have paid parental leave. So, experts are saying, hopefully this will move towards support for these programs and help address some of these systemic issues.
Yeah, Aimee, that would be great. There's been a lot of loss over the last year, but if this, springboards into some sort of systemic changes that makes work and family balance easier for us all, because as you point out, if a woman loses her job, it's not just a problem for the woman, it's a problem for the whole family. Hopefully that is the silver lining that comes out of this, some real changes that make life better for everyone. Aimee Picchi, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
So you can read Aimee's article. Just head to cbsnews.com.